Hello, I'm Basil Contovounesios, and I'm here to talk to you about dynamic variables, also known as special variables or dynamically bound variables. And I'm going to describe a tool that I've been working on for analyzing their use in both new and existing code. So unlike my colleagues' laissez-faire attitude towards proselytizing people to trampolines, I'm here to convince you that dynamic variables definitely are, in fact, a good thing. And so let's take, for example, this program. Let's say this is a complicated program in Emacs Lisp for no particular reason at all. It doesn't matter what the program does, but let's imagine that it hits the file system or prints messages to the user or does some other funky stuff. Well, what if we now want to parameterize it somehow? What if we want to, say, run it in a different context without having to modify the entire program? Well, you might know, enter dynamic variables. We can easily run it in a different directory, for example, in a different working directory, or we can even inhibit all the messages that it might annoy the user with. And this leaves the entire application that exists already intact. But not all is rosy. And of course, this flexibility can easily give rise to many bugs. Let's take, for example, this serialization function. If you're not familiar with Emacs Lisp, this is a function that takes a file and some data. It serializes the data that's in the current buffer to a file of the given name. Any eLispers here see the bug? Very quickly. Yes? 4? No, that's fine. The problem is that we use the same function in Emacs Lisp for both serializing and formatting messages to the user, which is print1 in this case. So what we actually need to do is avoid truncation, because otherwise we get data loss or unreadable data that we output. So the solution is easy. We just override these variables. But this problem is actually quite prevalent, this bug. In fact, I just submitted a PR last week to fix this in the debugger adapter protocol package. And okay, you might say, well, we have better, saner APIs today. Why are you using dynamic variables for these kind of things? And in fact, the new versions of Emacs have an overriding function argument, so you don't have to worry about the environment, and it embeds quite nicely. But how are we supposed to know this? Maybe you track development, maybe you are familiar with all the forward and backward compatibility problems, but how do we know what variables are being used in what contexts? So what if, for example, if we weren't calling print1 directly, what if it was deep down our call stack? How are we supposed to know all of the states that our callees and their callees are depending on? By the way, as an aside, while we're looking at this diagram, I think it's interesting to note that when we bind a variable at the top of this call stack, it goes all the way down. And this is kind of the symmetric operation to what happens with signals, which we were looking at earlier, which is in the opposite direction, where a signal can travel way up the call stack. So here's another problematic example that we get with dynamic variables. Here, we want to do some text search, and we want it to be case sensitive or case insensitive. But the little binding we have at the top also affects foo, which we may or may not have intended. This is, a simple mistake. But the problem is that neither of these pitfalls is something that we can be aware of through documentation necessarily, or that the compiler will warn us about. So how do we mitigate these problems? Well, we can track how dynamic variables are used. What we've done is we've done a little static analysis pass in Emacs Lisp, which looks at every function and all the functions that it calls, and transitively all the functions that those functions call, and it defines what we call the dependencies of that function on dynamic variables, which is what is referenced without being overridden in the context. And then we just propagate this up the graph, and we report this in some nice way. So for example, this is a little mock-up of what it might look like to the user who's writing a program. We might say, okay, well, you're calling print1. Well, are you aware that it's using all these variables? This isn't currently implemented, but it's going to be implemented soon. And this also helps with the discoverability of the API. If these variables weren't documented in the docstring, well, now you can see exactly what's being called underneath you. Another thing we might do is do some diffing across versions. So if if Emacs changes version, if you change your package, how does that affect people who depend on you? How do you change your program in the face of your dependencies changing, etc.? I'm going to skip the details of how we do this, and I'm going to close with the fact that we might want to model this as an effect system if we want to do it a little bit more formally. And I would like to reiterate that dynamic variables are in fact great, but we need a little bit more analysis. Thank you.